travel overnight and haven't entirely recovered yet. So if I stumble a little bit today, then that is why. Um, so yes, so today I'm speaking about circular economy and net zero, and asking the question: are they two sides of the same coin? Um, I won't skip to the answer of that question because that would be boring. We'll get there in the end. Right, so today we'll run through some key terminology, then we're going to explore the links between circular economy and climate action, and then I'm going to give you an example of circular economy for wind energy infrastructure. I don't think I will need the whole hour, so hopefully we'll also have a good time for questions and for discussion. Also very interested to hear what you have to say, for example, about the impact of procurement on enabling circular economy and reducing carbon emissions. Right, key terminology. So first of all, of course, circular economy, as already pointed out, circular economy has been defined in lots of different ways. I often say there are as many definitions or as many perceptions on circular economy as there are people involved. What we all have in common, I believe, is that we want to make better use of our materials and components and products. And for me, that really means that we have to minimize the input of resources. So we have to reduce the amount of resource that we take from the natural environment. We have to maximize our efforts to prevent waste. And we have to optimize all of the environmental and the social and the technical and the economic values of those materials, products, and components throughout their various life cycles. So circular economy is really a whole life cycle, but also a whole system approach. So there's something of a growing division, I would say, within the circular economy community about definitions of circular economy. So there's sort of a group of people who are very much looking at circular economy as a way to just close flows of resource loops. They're very focused on recycling. Also really optimistic about technological solutions. I'm also optimistic about that. I don't think it's sufficient to get to a sustainable circular economy. And there's this idea that this is, the recycling circular economy is more about improving efficiencies within the current political and economic structures. So it's kind of like adding on a few flows into the system rather than really transforming the system. And there's a growing group of people active in circular economy who have looked at the evidence a lot more, I would say, realizing that actually that is not sufficient to get to a sustainable outcome. We really have to go much further. And the bit that is especially important is that in addition to technological solutions, we need to change behaviors as well. Of course, we have to change practices, and that then also means often that we have to change what we consider important. So what are our values about what we consider important in life? That reducing of resource use is really important because we can see in the evidence base that the decoupling of resource use with GDP is either not happening or it's not happening sufficiently or certainly not fast enough. And that means that the whole sort of key premise of green growth is not substantiated. And that means that we have to move beyond green growth. We need a whole new idea about what such a political economic model then could look like, within which a circular economy could function and could become into being in a more sustainable way. And there, there's lots of ideas about that. I really like the idea of donut economics. We can speak about that maybe another time. I wasn't really going to go into it today, but I've been this whole morning at the launch of the Leeds Donut, which is really exciting as well. So what I said about reducing resource use, it introduces a whole set of changes in practices. So on an individual level, it means that we all have to try to buy less. If we do need to buy something that has been used before, at least buy something that has been made sustainably, use things for longer. If you can't use them anymore, give them away so that somebody else can use it, fix things. And if none of these things are possible, then at least recycle it. But recycling is very much the last step in the chain and not the first one, as it's often being still presented when we talk about circular economy. And that then also brings me to the point about changing values, so changing what we consider important. I also very much believe that we have to go beyond just reducing impacts. Actually, I think that people can have a positive impact on the environment. Being an ecologist, that is my view on this. And I don't think that we have to, of course, we have to reduce our negative impacts on the environment, but actually we have to change our relationship altogether with the environment and deliver more positive impacts, because we can also make a really positive difference and be sort of a positive keystone species for our or in our environment. We have to reconsider, we have to change the distribution of resources and money so that everybody can have a chance for a good life within environmental boundaries as well. So that is sort of my view on circular economy. So now you know where I stand on this. And then I'm going to link that to net zero, carbon neutral. So carbon neutral, I'm sure you all will be familiar with this. So I might be stating the obvious, but carbon neutral basically means that we're going to offset the emissions that we are responsible for. So for example, this week, unfortunately, I had to fly. I couldn't travel by train or by boat. So I had to fly. So I offset my carbon emissions. So now somebody is going to plant a few trees to absorb these carbon emissions back out of the atmosphere again. Net zero is about eliminating the emissions in the first place. So I could also have said, you know what, I don't need to be here. So I'm not going to fly at all. And that's very often what I do. And then we kind of prevent these emissions from coming into being in the first place. So that's what net zero is about. First of all, you kind of try to avoid the emissions as much as possible. And then the emissions that you do create, you're going to offset those so that you neutralize them again. Right, so carbon emissions, again, I'm sure you're all much more familiar with this than I am. So it's really awkward to be explaining this. But of course, greenhouse gas emissions are often measured in scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So scope 1 is what an organization is directly responsible for. So these are the emissions coming from from the processes, from the operations that you're owning or controlling. So for example, if you are a manufacturing company, then these are the emissions that are coming from the processes on your site. And when you talk about greenhouse gas reporting, then those are often obligatory to report. Scope 2 are the indirect greenhouse gas emissions from power and from heating, cooling that you might be buying in. So again, if you are manufacturing and you're using steam in your processes, and that steam is being generated on another site, on a neighboring site, and you bring it in from there, then those emissions from the steam generation would be counted in your scope 2 emissions. Again, if you're reporting greenhouse gas emissions, then those are often obligatory to report. Scope 3 are all of the other indirect greenhouse gas emissions, either upstream or downstream from where you are in the chain. So if you are manufacturing a company, again, then and you're using materials in the processes, then, for example, the emissions that are generated from the extracting and from the processing of the materials, they would fall under your scope 3. Also, if you are generating waste, and then those need to be processed, there will be emissions associated with that. They would also be counted into your scope 3. So this is where we often find circular economy, because circular economy is, of course, resource focused, and therefore this is very often you often find the scope 3. That circular economy impacts in the scope 3 emissions. And that's really difficult because scope 3 is generally considered difficult to control, but there are ways of doing it. For example, via changing your policies within your organization, uh, especially procurement policy. So we're really interested to hear more of your thoughts about that as well. And of course, collaborating within your supply chain. I think especially that last point is often really an under-investigated and underestimated challenge. I think supply chain collaboration is very challenging, and we don't know half about how to actually do this in the best way possible. So there's lots of space here for learning together while we are busy reducing carbon emissions and implementing circular economy. Right. So if you want to read more about this, my colleague, Paul Jensen, actually, when he was still in the Hull City Council, but he now is at University of Leeds in New York's Circular Lab as well. But he has written a short piece on our website, circulareconomy.leeds.ac.uk. You can find just a brief overview of the link between circular economy and net zero there, if you wanted to just repeat for yourself what things were again, because sometimes when we speak about them, then we kind of get confused and lose track of stuff. Right, circular economy, climate action then. I think very important to realize that circular economy and low carbon economy are really two pieces of the same puzzle. Circularity prioritizes renewables, both in terms of renewable energy and renewable materials. When we build low carbon infrastructure for the renewable energy, for example, then that requires lots of resources. We don't necessarily have easy access to them. Resource security is a growing concern. So again, for that, circular economy can offer important solutions, and I'll come back to that in the next section of this presentation. But first, I want to talk about the huge potential to reduce carbon emissions from resource efficiency measures. In fact, out of all of the actions that we can take to reduce carbon emissions, it's actually resource efficiency that has the biggest untapped potential. But actually, often when we talk about climate action and about strategies and policies, especially from government, but also elsewhere, then we don't really think about resource efficiency. Then often it's about renewables, it's about electric vehicles, and resource efficiency kind of gets forgotten about. And that's a shame, because there's a lot to win here, and we really should be thinking about it. For example, the UK used to be a front runner, I would say, in this. We used to have a national industrial symbiosis program, and just between 2005 and 2013, that it was government funded, NISP in England managed to divert lots of resources from landfill. They also prevented many resources from being mined and processed in the first place, because we could use waste and byproducts instead. Save lots of water. Interesting subject, I think, to speak about. We often forget about the water involved in circulating materials, or I should say circulating other materials in our economy, especially when we talk about bioeconomy. There's this idea like, oh, we're just going to make a completely bio-based economy. That would actually require so much water, that's fresh water, I should say. We can't possibly access that sustainably anywhere actually in the world. But the statistic that I really want to draw your attention to is the potential to reduce carbon emissions, because just within the time that NISP was funded in England, they reduced carbon emissions by 42 million tons. I've been told that that's the equivalent of taking 20 million cars off the road for a year in England. So it's a lot, basically. When we talk about companies and with government bodies, then they often they are interested, of course, in the environmental statistics, but maybe more so about the economic and the social ones. So, for example, industrial symbiosis is also a really great way of generating new sales, reducing costs, and creating and safeguarding lots of jobs as well. So there's that it's not difficult to make an argument for industrial symbiosis. It's not difficult to make an argument for circular economy and save carbon in the meantime. It's still not necessarily happening. Okay, so industrial symbiosis is great, recycling is good, but actually we've got to use less altogether. Using less is far better. So here the example of textiles. UK is a really big consumer of textiles on average. We use nearly 27 kilograms per year per person. That's about double of the European average. Not sure what it is about UK culture that we are such over consumers of textiles and that we waste so much of it. We could, of course, go and build lots of recycling facilities for this. Could be a good thing to do. But in my view, then you would still have to spend so much carbon emissions on building those sites because, a recycling facility is also made out of materials, and that also requires lots of processing and lots of carbon emissions. Actually, we may as well leapfrog towards a more sustainable state and consume a lot less. And then you'd also have to invest less. You'd save actually lots of money in new recycling infrastructure. But you would have to invest in other infrastructure, such as better information provisions, possibly maybe some carbon or broader sustainability labeling. You'd have to have different kinds of infrastructure, for example, for reuse and for sharing of things. So it would also involve some changes on the high street, arguably. So you would still have to invest in different kinds of infrastructure, but you would probably save money on building physical infrastructure. So also that could be an interesting business case, I think, depending on where you are in the world and which government you are. Right, so in Transfire, which is currently mostly paying my bills for sure, Transfire is the Transforming Foundation Industries Research and Innovation Hub. We combine those things. So we try to minimize or support foundation industries to minimize resource use in the processing, but also support industrial symbiosis, both within, or I should say between foundation industries, but also with their communities of companies that are located around foundation industries, as well as communities living there as well. So foundation industries include, for example, cement, glass, metals, really heavy emitting industries that produce about 75% of the stuff that we have in our economy, but also generate loads of carbon emissions. So that's a program that's still going to keep running for the next just over 2 years. So we've been going now for nearly 1 year, and we've got 2 years of initial funding left to build a proactive and inclusive interdisciplinary hub to support the transformation of those industries. Right. I want to finish with an example of circular economy for wind energy infrastructure. Of course, like I mentioned, circular economy has renewables as a key tenet, but unfortunately, much of our renewable energy infrastructure is not designed with a circular economy in mind. And I do use a lot of stuff. So here we have inventoried how much materials are being used in the UK offshore wind. So this is an inventory based on wind farms that were already built in 2019, or by 2019, I should say, or that were in the process of being built. So, for example, it doesn't include a few really big wind farms, such as Triton Knoll, which hadn't broken water at the time yet. Which will make a big difference for some of these material flows that would almost double because of the presence of Triton Knoll. But you will see here, just sort of, looking through the numbers, how much metals, for example, are required to build those new turbines. Actually, the biggest impact from offshore wind turbines comes from the steel. It's the biggest impact especially on the abiotic environment. If we go towards floating wind, then I was quite surprised to learn actually that for floating wind we would be using lots more concrete. So it's quite amazing how many tons of concrete will be hanging under a floating offshore wind turbine. You wouldn't really expect that. You kind of wonder how it works, how it actually stays afloat. Nevertheless, the point here is we're going to use lots more steel, copper, also some of the critical materials such as neodymium, um, and yeah, they will have undoubtedly a big impact on the environment as well. We should still do it. It's no excuse to stay with fossil fuels, but we also have to consider those impacts. So in the last years, I've been co-producing circular economy strategies for wind infrastructure. So we identified 18 in the end. Of course, design being a really important one, and within that, especially dematerialization. So with smarter design, try to reduce the amount of resources that are being used, and thereby also already start to prevent lots of waste, because what you don't produce in the first place also doesn't become a waste. Modularization, modular design, very important strategy. So being able to take things apart so that you can reuse it if it's still good, or the ability then to fix it. Really important strategy, but difficult in the wind industry because of the continuous innovation and the continuing growing scale of wind turbines in order to stay competitive and reduce costs as well. So then you also see strategies to kind of slow down the flow of resources in the economy. So slowing down in terms of the moment of producing a wind turbine component and the moment that it goes to waste. So you make that time longer. And that includes strategies that are very well established, such as maintenance and repair. But of course, there's also the reuse of parts or the repurposing. For example, a turbine blade, reusing it directly as a wind turbine blade, or maybe cutting it into pieces and making bike shelters and bridges and garden furniture and things like that from it. Refurbishing, remanufacturing, still very, I would say, almost not used in the wind industry, very early days in the UK. But I think once wind turbines start to stabilize a bit in size, this is actually where the most interesting business opportunities may be for the UK in particular, to, for example, increase the activity of companies in the UK in the wind industry supply chain. Because at the moment, much of the manufacturing is actually not happening in the UK, and we're not benefiting as much from this growing industry as perhaps we would have hoped. Not going to run through all the strategies in detail, but you'll see there a potential to extend the lifetime. The average lifetime of an offshore wind farm at the moment is between 20 and 25 years. For many parts of a turbine, there's no reason why they couldn't be used actually for 40 years or even longer. Durability has a far bigger potential to reduce environmental impacts than recycling. We're talking about maybe 10, 25 times more potential to reduce environmental impacts when compared to recycling materials. Repowering is what you do when you only when you replace a part of the turbines and maybe build up, for example, a bigger turbines with bigger capacity to generate power compared to what was there before. Decommissioning is obviously just taking de-electrifying the wind farm and taking everything down and then restoring a site to the previous state. I'll say a few more things about that in a couple of slides, because this is not exactly what the plan is for the UK. It's not really the common practice to decommission in such a way. And I think the rest, you will be aware of the importance of disassembly. Actually, this is where possibly, again, a very big business opportunity exists. Not many people are thinking about how to best disassemble a wind turbine so that you can actually reuse parts and so that you get a really high quality recycled from that. because if you can separate the materials better in the disassembly stage, then you can also get a much cleaner recycling stream and much higher quality material coming out of it that then can be used for a better price as well. And the data and information is absolutely essential as an enabling strategy. We need to know what is actually in these flows in terms of the components, but also the materials. If we don't know what's in there, then it's really difficult to give end users the assurances that what they get is indeed what they think it is, and that's of a good quality, so that they can use it with confidence again. Right, where are we currently? State of play in terms of circular economy and offshore wind. It's very early days. So this is from a review, and then also reflected on a review with more than 100 stakeholders from the wind industry, from the removal industry, and from recycling as well. So this is quite reflective of the practice as well as the theoretical basis. There's lots of knowledge on maintenance and repair, but all of the other circular economy strategies are still early days. Decommissioning is fast growing in terms of area of expertise, but when we look at the recycling of turbines and everything from repowering and extending the lifetime to the more component level strategies such as reuse and repurposing, remanufacturing, it's hardly developed, and some of them are not developed at all, such as waste prevention and recertification, recovering sites. There's very little expertise on that, which is a bit worrying. Right. Like I mentioned, I mean, there's a real risk here that in the wind industry that we take too narrow of a perspective and that we are repeating mistakes such as what has happened in oil and gas, commissioning and now the decommissioning. When we look at where parts are going, for example, the turbine blades are very difficult to manage at the end of use. They're made of a very strong composite material of glass fibers and plastics, basically. Makes it very difficult to take it apart. They often are landfilled or incinerated. There's some mechanical recycling possible as well, but that's more downcycling. Towers often said that they're easy to recycle. It's not that easy actually, because of the alloys in it and the coating on it. And often it's actually 60 to 85% of the weight that's being recycled or rather downcycled. So there's actually a lot of steel that is not being recycled when you add it all up. Cables are often written as if they're going to stay in the seabed. This is a really big issue for me because the cables are they have a lot of copper in them. It's a really valuable material. It's a material absolutely essential for the energy transition. We're going to need so much of it. And here we've got just basically standard decommissioning plan for UK offshore wind farms is to leave the cables in the seabed. In my view, under international agreements, this is actually illegal. You can sometimes say to leave something in the seabed, such as a part of the foundation or maybe even some cables. But that is by exception, and you have to ask for a special derogation for that. It shouldn't be the standard like how it is being proposed at the moment. And foundations again would be proposed to be cut just below the seabed, and then the rest would be removed. There's often lots of cement or concrete, I should say, involved in that, which is a bit questionable whether it's actually advantageous to recycle concrete. But we can discuss about that. It's because of the high energy requirements to recycle concrete, and arguably it's actually not possible to recycle it at all because of the chemical bonding. And then about the carbon blindness, I mean, we're building all these wind farms to reduce carbon emissions. Definitely, we need to continue that, but we're kind of forgetting about the abiotic impacts. Most of the most used material in a turbine are metals. And the mining and the processing of those metals has a huge impact on the abiotic environment. And therefore, actually, strategies that will help to recycle those materials and use them for as long as possible in a component is really essential to kind of buffer those kind of impacts. Otherwise, we risk that we're just displacing the impacts on climate with impacts on another part of the environment, and that's, obviously that's not sustainable. It's not what we should be doing in a circular economy. So here are some of the resource-related sustainability challenges and the related strategies that we could take to mitigate, to address those kind of challenges. For example, that many of the parts that we use in wind turbines still rely on fossil fuels. So, for example, for the processing of materials and in the manufacturing, it's really difficult to switch away from fossil fuel use. But also in the materials directly, such as the resins used in wind turbines, they are fossil fuel based. So there's still a reliance on fossil fuels, even for this low carbon technology. Growing resource exploitation, obviously we're going to, if we're going to grow fourfold the amount of turbines between 2 years ago and 2030, and then again 3-4-fold by 2050. You can imagine what's going to happen with the resources that we're going to have to exploit. So it's really important to design with less materials and to use recycled materials, for example. Growing resource competition, especially for copper and for critical materials, strategically a really big headache. But perhaps the focus goes a bit too much towards this. I sometimes feel that we are very concerned about critical materials, and rightly so. But actually, it's the steel that we should be thinking about the most when it comes to wind turbines. Material innovation, important aspect to move away, for example, from reliance on materials that are made with fossil fuels. Durability and lifetime extension, like I mentioned, far more potential to reduce environmental impacts with durability than with recycling. The end of use management, how do we actually manage at the end of use? How do we actually take down turbines in a good way? Again, it's not an area where there's a lot of experience, and because of the high uncertainty, the cost can also be far higher than anticipated. They could actually be likely 4 to 10 times higher than currently estimated, introduces risk for government as decommissioners of last resort as well. And that is also related then to the sustainable decommissioning as well, which again, we don't have that much experience in. And it's really important that, now that we are starting to decommission the first wind farms, that we also learn from that and feedback on the design stage so that we can prevent those kind of issues in the future. So that was a bit of a ramble through the relation between climate action and circular economy. So to conclude, to answer the question, are they two sides of the same coin? I would say no, but we cannot achieve net zero without a circular economy. And we really need a circular economy to avoid sustainability issues, trade-offs from developing low carbon technologies, from taking climate action. Really happy to take any questions, any discussion points. I'm going to stop sharing my slides so I can also see you again. Just looking forward to hopefully a good discussion.
Thanks very much, Anne. Let me just make sure. Well, keep my camera off. Actually, thanks very much, Anne. That was fascinating. Lots of new information for me, certainly, in terms of what sits behind the wind farms and the kinds of considerations that and the discussions that we need to have. I'm just noticing Andy Rees in the chat was saying that those developing wind farms and other infrastructures need to develop decommissioning plans at the design stage, which I think Anne
Yes.
put that comment in, and then you went on to say that very point that that it needs to be really sort of designed in at the start in order for it to be successful.
Yeah, I mean, the decommissioning plans are an interesting point. So the guidance for developing the decommissioning programs is almost copied from oil and gas. It was already rubbish for oil and gas. It didn't get any better for wind. Um, the problem is that they're not proactive. The decommissioning programs. They don't have to involve crucial people who could actually help to improve the decommissioning plans and who could improve the end of use management, such as the resources sector, such as those people that are impacted um, by the resourcing of new materials if they're not being managed properly at the end of use, such as new companies. There's lots of new innovative companies that are doing really brilliant things at the end of use of energy infrastructure, such as really innovative reuse and repurposing solutions, developing remanufacturing, and none of these have to be involved in development of decommissioning plans or indeed at the end of use when you have to review the decommissioning program before you put it into practice. So yeah, I mean, I would say that actually bases, in my view, that they might actually be breaking the law. I would go as far as that, because they basically imply in the guidance of decommissioning programs that companies don't really have to consider reuse. I don't have time to take them to court over that, but I wouldn't mind if somebody did.
Okay. I mean, what's interesting, Anne, is even in my little talk about the cake program at the start, we were talking about the importance of efficient design. That's where it starts, and really thinking about decommissioning at that point, modular, ease of repair, all that kind of stuff. Of course, not just applicable to the infrastructure you're talking about, but it's actually applicable to all kinds of product design. And I guess that's the link to procurement, that from a public sector perspective, if we can be a positive driver for change in terms of our procurement policies, insisting on some of these things, including models such as leasing and renting, that really does shift the responsibility onto the manufacturer, you know.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, but that's actually it's an interesting point, and I would really love to have more insights into that. I mean, I often understand from people in procurement teams that they're not really allowed to consider, for example, leasing of things. I mean, this would be a big opportunity, right? If you you would also be saving money rather than buying something, you'd be renting it. Um, yeah, or buying reused. I think that there might be some, especially in the water industry. What I understand is that there's disincentives to buy reused equipment. It's not my area of expertise by any means, but that is what I heard, and it seems like it's in the power of of government organizations and organizations active in the water industry, for example, to possibly change that.
Okay, well, we've certainly got some Welsh government people on the call, so maybe they'd like to comment. Some really interesting questions come up in the chat, actually. I really like this one. This is from Adam West. Do you have any thoughts on landfill mining to retrieve resources we've already disposed of?
Yeah, absolutely. So before this, until 2019, I was coordinating the resource recovery from waste program, and we investigate a lot of these landfill mining solutions. I think it's absolutely possible, and I mean, you would. It's easy to think it's a no-brainer that we should be doing this. In some ways, I think it is a no-brainer. For example, we're washing a lot of copper from Paris Mountain into the sea. To me, that doesn't make any sense. We need the copper, so and it's actually you can remine that in really efficient ways. The efficiency of the technologies for copper, but also for lithium, for example, they are about 90, 97, 99%. So you can use bio bio-based technologies to the really targeted mobilization of those metals in the matrix that's being landfilled, and to basically leach the material out of it and to recover it. Of course, there's also a massive environmental risk with it, which is what is, I think, is holding it back a lot, alongside of the social concerns of people not necessarily being excited about opening a new mine in their backyard. But of course, the environmental risk is that if you do this targeted mobilization of materials that are, if in high concentrations, they are nasty in the environment. And if something goes wrong with the capturing of it, then you've got a really big issue on your hands straight away. So there is further research necessary to make sure that those solutions are safe, that you can really manage that risk a lot better than what is currently possible. But in principle, it's, we need to do this. For example, we can be almost completely, no more, we can be more than self-sustaining for some of the low carbon materials, such as vanadium. Vanadium is a material that goes into the steel alloys for the towers, for wind turbines. It's we've got to do this. And at the same time, because of climate change, I could talk about this forever, so stop me. But because of climate change, there's also a risk that many of the landfills that are in coastal areas, that they're going to basically disappear into the sea, which obviously wouldn't be ideal if we got all that waste washing into the marine environment. So that also is an argument for landfill mining, to rather recover it now, and prevent that kind of disaster.
Okay, thanks very much for that. I'm just going to go to the room. Tony, if you're in the room, are there any questions from the room that you've identified? I don't know whether you can unmute and...
Yeah, I mean, and thanks for a really interesting presentation there. I suppose, speaking on behalf of the people that are in the cohort in the room, we're in West Wales here. Have you any advice for people working within the public services, within the public sector, of what they can do at this point?
Yeah, definitely. Right. So I think, of course, it depends which team you're in, really. But it's very important to speak with communities, to actually understand what communities consider important, what they need, what they want, to really develop that relationship. There's often already so much drive. Lots of people are really concerned about the environment, about climate. They want to do something. They often have lots of ideas about what to do, but they lack the kind of support to really take action. And I think once you go out and really open up and just it's sometimes a bit scary, but just to be really open and just to ask, like, okay, who are you, and what do you think is important? What do you want to do? Do you want to do anything? I think it's invaluable, actually. What we find in Yorkshire and the Humber is that there's so much momentum for this, and you just have to encourage. And I think, from a government perspective, and very much financially stretched councils in particular, this can also be an affordable way of taking action on the climate emergency. I think there's a risk in thinking about in those ways, because I think it has been abused in the past. But nevertheless, that relationship is really important to build it up. The other thing is, of course, to change your procurement. Actually, there's companies, there's other organizations that want to provide circular economy and sustainable products and services. Use them. That's it. Just
Okay, thanks very much, Anne. I've got a generic one here from James. He's saying, first of all, he's saying thank you, very engaging and insightful. What is the most important barrier we need to overcome to achieve circular economies?
right. I think it's mindset, first and foremost. Most people I speak with, also in public sector, or outside of that actually, they have no idea what circular economy is. Even though if you explain it even a little bit, then intuitively they very quickly get it and want to get on with it. But it's actually that mindset of actually knowing about it, but then also kind of understanding it as a, in a system level way, in a holistic way, and to understand that you have to then also collaborate. So that's the other part of the sort of the mindset and the attitude change that needs to happen. Not to just working your silo on economic regeneration, and then there's somebody else working on the waste management, and then there's somebody else doing something on climate action. You need to come together and work across silos. Is really important and often difficult. I think it's also a funding issue that I don't think it's necessary that people don't want to collaborate. I think they do. But over the past 12 years, for sure, systematically, these kind of connections and funding to get people together have been cut. And it just means that, for example, well, I don't know about Wales, but in England, for sure, the connection between people working in planning teams and environment agency, that connection has been pretty much cut, which leads to actually is quite debilitating when you want to take action in a sustainable way, and if you want to be quick. Or for regional collaboration, just to get, for example, people together who are working on mineral and resource planning in a region. We used to have a team for that. Now we don't. It's really unproductive that, so collaboration also takes money. And I think that needs to be recognized. Collaboration is also a skill, again, needs to be recognized. If you've got people that are good in supporting collaboration, you may want to keep hold of them. And often that is not the case. The other important barrier that I would say is about data. So to actually know your stuff, what is in your region, and for how long is it going to stay there, and what can we do with it? It requires lots of data, lots of information to really inform decision making, and often we don't have that. Then you have to find ways of actually getting that information together, often in a co-production process. I refer back to the previous point that often there's no money to do that. So yeah, it's like, you get these catch-22s that are really difficult to get out of sometimes.
Okay, thanks very much, Anne. I mean, one of the things that occurred to me there is you were using a lot of the language that we've been trying to use on the CAPE programme, but that's exactly what we're trying to encourage: regional collaboration, and really provide the time and the resources and the and the structure really to facilitate that. Anything more from the room, Tony?
I also see Andy's comment here. I do have sympathy for communities that have been, that have had a landfill next to them. And maybe do you mean that they might be keen to get rid of the landfill, just have it remined and cleaned up? I would say that must be a benefit as well. But you might, at the same time, you might actually reopen basically a mine, which I know that there's lots of, lots of social challenges around that. Often it is about managing the process well, though, just to make sure that it's beneficial for everyone.
Sure. I'm not sure whether Andy can actually unmute. So
No.
yes, yes, he's just typed in. Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, if you actually open them up. I mean, you're right. If you would actually open them up, you would. But if you use these approaches where you leach materials out of a landfill, then you don't.
Okay. Go on, Tony. Did you want to say something?
No, thank you, Anne. You've stunned us all into silence here. What was really interesting is before lunch we were discussing exactly what your response was to the public sector, and we come to that conclusion ourselves almost as a group, and as a group who are fairly new to circular economy as well, although practitioners who can affect what's going on in the public service, I think. Thanks for your input today. It was really interesting. Took me somewhere that I hadn't even considered decommissioning of wind.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Okay. Well, that pretty much wraps up the presentation. Thanks very much to Anne for her time today. If anybody on the webinar wants to continue this conversation, then please get in touch with us at the Cake team, and we can have a future conversation about your involvement. So please do that. But thanks very much, Anne. Much appreciated, and hopefully we'll catch up soon.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me.
Okay.
It's been a pleasure.
Bye.
Okay. Bye.
Thank you.